Won't you lend your lungs to me? Mine are collapsing. Plant my feet and bitterly breathe up the time that's passed. Breath I'll take and breath I'll give. Pray the day's not poised. Stand among the ones that live in lonely indecision.
All right. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Lynn.
It's April 3rd. I think we're taping episode 34, but I'm really behind on editing. But you've been writing a lot about Evola lately, and I really appreciate the way you've been going through and writing your impressions as you read and as you have annotated that book. I think it's really helpful for someone like me who's never read Evola and might not ever get the chance to do it. And I think it also demonstrates, and you can talk about this if you want, but it demonstrates your process for when you're reading this type of thing or history or whatever it might be. Is this something that you typically do?
I have his book right here. And you can see I have a code that I mark in the margins there. T, Q, a bracket just means I want to follow the narrative. When I get to, I'll write sideways in the margins for certain subjects that I might want to come back and reference. And if you see here, I have this number. If he's got a decent sized essay and he's covering more than one subject, which is usually the case, if it's just two things that he's covering and he's contrasting them, that's easy. But some of these things, I've identified 6 different threads, main themes in his essay. And what I'll do is whenever I come across that theme, usually they're one on top of the other, but sometimes they're spread, I'll put the theme number on the side next to a line. So I'll use a bracket for this is narrative that I want to condense. I'll put a Q for something I want to quote, T for something I think makes it for a title, D for diction, if it's something I might want to put in the footnotes. And then, so with this one, Army of the Vision of the World, you can see at the top I've got 5 competing titles that I've extracted from his quotes. There's only one book I ever read that I couldn't extract a decent title from, and it was written by a libertarian. Okay, so that
not very quotable.
Right. So, and I have here these different nates on heroism, the state, the Hellenes, and this is how I'll annotate this, and I'll come back and mark it off. I do the same thing with all the history books that I use for sources for my history. And that allows me to write it essentially when I'm publishing these articles on Evola's work and on other people. I just did one with E. Michael Jones. He did a brilliant article's like 30 pages long, and I condensed it to 3 pages. Basically, with my own commentary in there to try to make sure the main points, all this nonfiction stuff that I'm writing and publishing on a website, for the most part, this is my notes. I'll eventually end up arranging them and writing connected material in a book. But it's really it's how I go about it. It's what I did with books on conquistadors when I was researching my novels on 16th century America. I did the same thing with that. And I was having such a hard time grasping Evola, I couldn't cover the book, even though it was only about 140 pages. I couldn't cover it in one review. So I just decided to look at it a chapter at a time, just like I did with the bigger Robert E. Howard stories that I did that way. And it's been helpful for me and being able to grasp what he was getting at, because it's stuff that we're not raised to be. We're raised to laugh at anything like this. In fact, a couple of mainstream discussions that I've read on Evola, he's laughed at as if he's Ichabod Crane talking about people riding around with no heads chopping off heads. That's what we're programmed in our modern society, postmodern now. We're really programmed to laugh at any of these notions that he puts, but the detailed manner in which he puts these ideas on paper is actually disturbing if you read it. It really bothers you. So the few people that read it will have a tendency to one, either use it as like background, partial background memory for looking at other things, which I think is the way it's intended, or they just try to get other people not to read it, to laugh at it and to say, this guy is a kook, this guy is a pagan. That's generally how he's denounced. He's an Italian pagan. And I wanted to try to get a third way. I had read it the first way, the way I think it was intended, but I wanted to get more out of it than that, especially considering that he wrote a lot more than this. This is one of his slimmer volumes.
Well, I like the way that you're doing it because on one hand, it's clear that you're doing it for your own study, but on the other hand, it makes it really accessible to the rest of us who aren't looking at the original work.
Well, I like to think that if I could regurgitate it in a manner that I could comprehend when I reread it, then everybody else would be able to comprehend it too.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So that's, and I like the way he references ancient mythology, because that's something I've read a lot about and just read it in a scatterbrained fashion, or I read it looking for specific clues to, for instance, ritualized combat and sports. So I read almost the entire Ancients collection at the Peabody Library. It was around 200 books, but it was like letting your dog unpack your groceries. I'm reading this stuff looking for anything that I can use to uncover the source of boxing. So I'm really mining it in a specific way. And yes, I got other impressions, but it wasn't the right way to read that stuff. I read Quintilian. It's supposed to be training for ancient warriors. I read that for the purpose of getting insight into essentially the violence this guy viewed in public ceremonies and everything, and his thoughts on war and all. It was like reading stuff written by great statesmen today just to try to determine what their views on the sports of their time were. So in that sense, I read a lot of stuff that I didn't use in the writing because I actually only found fragments. I could read 20 volumes of Cicero, and I ended up getting 2 paragraphs of stuff on the ancient boxing. So essentially I forgot a lot of this stuff, so it's nice to have him as a pointer.
Well, you have very good study habits. I think any college professor would be really pleased. They might not be pleased with your conclusions, but
Huh?
just with your study habits. I just wanted to point that out for people who are just starting out their journey of autodidact reading and studying, and so I just like the way you do it. So.
Well, thank you. And if there's any 40-year-old female feminist college professors listening, I think if we got an opportunity to discuss things over your desk, that I'd be able to convince you that some of my conclusions were well-founded. Okay. That's all I have to say about that. I don't want to talk to the male college. I don't want to talk to the male college professors.
They don't want to talk to you either. Well, reading all your pieces on Evola, I started thinking about it's a lot about the warrior and the warrior spirit, and thinking about other things that we have talked about. So I remember talking about the Civil War, especially when you were doing the videos with Mesclun on the monuments, and how the Civil War represented the first big mechanized war, industrial war, where the North just had superior manpower and superior material, and the South had superior fighters and superior generals, but we all know the outcome.
I believe it was the very first war that used trains to rail troops to the front, where you could rail tens of thousands of men. I think Longstreet was railed with 13 or 14,000 troops from Virginia to fight at the Battle of Chickamauga, which is near Chattanooga. So they actually were able to rail troops to a different theater. In World War II, on the Russian front, for instance, the Germans would manage their offensive thrust by first getting all these tanks onto trains and then railing them to where they had to. So your equipment's not all beat up. If Longstreet would have had to do what Hannibal did and march his men over the Appalachians, he'd only had 8,000 of them by the time he got there, and they would have been worn out. So that made a big difference, and your rail capacity was a huge difference. I played simulations of the Civil War, and yeah, I used an example of the Confederates successfully using rail cap. But when you're playing the Confederates, you'd have a rail cap. It was the capacity. You might be able to rail 10,000 guys, 15,000 guys, 5,000 guys in a 2-month period. But the Union didn't even have a rail cap limit. Now, you could take 100,000 guys and put them on trains, and it's just such a huge thing. Now, I would say that with that war, one of the reasons why the Union won, they didn't have to win. I think they were 7-1 favorites as far as I've been able to determine. The key reason why they won was because their strategy was more in line with their capabilities than the enemy's strategy was. Under Robert E. Lee and men like Braxton Bragg, the main focus that Jefferson Davis wanted was destroy the main army of the enemy in the field and then try to impose your will on them. But these men would be so exhausted after these types of battles, you couldn't exploit a victory. A victory was usually a Pyrrhic victory one way or another. And the Union used their command of the seas and their industrial capacity to build all these ironclad boats that essentially encircled the Confederacy down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, and all the way around. So the Confederacy became, after Vicksburg was taken, this was the same week, I think, that Bobby Lee was handed his really only major defeat when he was trying to get shoes from a shoe factory in Pennsylvania for his guys at Gettysburg. Once Vicksburg was taken, then the Confederacy was now split into the Transmiss, which was run by Kirby Smith. It was its own separate third world country. And the Confederacy was now an island, and it was just besieged by this industrial power. And they still came pretty close to being able to make the war nasty enough that Lincoln would not gain re-election. That still almost happened, and they were probably only 2 minor battles from achieving that. But it's a good example. It's probably the watermark that you want to pick for when heroism is finally extinguished by industry. And from here on out, if you have a hero, he's usually a general. He's somebody like Patton or Rommel that can consistently manage this new type of grand-scale warfare. You know, armies in the modern sense are now things that might number 1 million men. That's
right.
Just ridiculous.
Right. So the scale has changed entirely since then. That was the turning point, but now we have the world powers with not just nuclear weapons, but so-called conventional weapons that just dwarf any ability, any human capacity to oppose them. But at the same time, that's not really the way that wars are fought. We have, right now, it seems like there's a lot of kind of lower intensity conflicts and these kind of covert conflicts where you have ISIS and nobody really knows what ISIS is. Is it the CIA? Is it the Mossad? Or no, it's all those things. So war has changed in some ways, but it hasn't changed. It hasn't maximized. That trip to like the maximal technology seems to have stalled in some way.
The wars became so ruinous. Probably the last full-scale modern war that you're going to have on record would be the first Gulf War. The second Gulf War, in a way, doesn't even count. You just went in and paved this place, and then you get to see what the new type of warfare is going to look at, this fourth-generation warfare, which takes you back to a number of combatants that you saw in the Iliad. you're now, if you look at the number of men who are out there on the point of the spear killing other men for this gargantuan U.S. military machine, you're talking about a couple thousand guys worldwide. Whatever the quick reaction force is, the different branches of the service, they all have their special ops units. That's about it. That's who's seeing combat. So you're now getting back to a place where the replacement for the hero is really the sniper. If you look at heroic postmodern military movies now, you're seeing the sniper cast as the hero, because you can now have, since you're no longer conducting this mass warfare, you can now have a two-man team go out there with one of these high-tech sniper rifles and really do things. Similar to what rebels might have done in the Revolutionary War, shooting British officers with their deer rifles, or longbowmen knocking the French knights out of their saddle during the 100 Years' War. So in that sense, it's kind of come full circle, but there's a real strong thrust on the part of the neocon management, the people that manage these wars, is to dispose of these heroic types of men and get them into military contracting, use them against civilian populations as a suppression force, and try to replace these guys as much as possible with drones.
Okay, well, I think you're right, and this is what I wanted to get at. You mentioned the sniper. So I thought about, what is the ultimate kind of distillation of this concept where, you know, the warrior is an individual. And I've thought of examples in literature, and I wanted to ask you, what about single combat? I thought about, you know, David and Goliath in the Bible, and in Ouroboros, the book that we're reading, they had the champion Goldry go up against the king from the other country, the other nation. So can you explain what to the listeners what we mean if you say single combat, like the champion?
That was, by the way, that was a good example in the worm Ouroboros. That was essentially an ancient Greco-Roman wrestling match that he redid for that mythology. Well, first of all, getting to single combat. If I'm going to take two people that have had really extremely violent lives that I know, I'm one of them, and Big Ron's the other one, and he's like 15 years younger than me. And we've also had better luck than we deserved with ladies. Okay, so, you know, Ron's delivering pizzas and he ends up, you know, 5 of these like pizza delivery households become places where the lady invites him inside. Okay, and that type of thing. If you find yourself as a 42-year-old man and you're working and you're a kind of guy that beats the shit out of other guys or other guys are afraid of, then you end up in that position. I was in that position working in supermarkets where you got all these 35-year-old divorcees, you know, looking at me as the next potential husband. Ron and I were always really willing to get physical with other guys and to fight. And we were generally more willing than prudence would dictate to take on a new sexual relationship with a woman. But both of us declined on numerous occasions to have group sex. Okay? Neither one of us ever did that. And this, if you're a guy that women tend to be attracted to in the workplace, yes, this comes up. A couple of bar owners have tried to get Ron to, like, you know, and I had ladies try to talk me into doing that with them and their girlfriend. And it's something that, if you've done that and it's been really successful. So, for instance, if you've successfully have had a sexual relationship one-on-one, you don't want to have group sex. You know, it's really a turnoff. And it's the same thing with fighting. It's really, you'll usually see guys that are really competent in a one-on-one fighting situation. They don't want things to get muddied up. They don't want their effectiveness in that situation to get diluted by some kind of group participation. So it's not hard to find a guy that you take a bunch of guys like Ron and I, and then you start having them fight each other, and eventually people like me go away really quick because we don't have the physical goods, and then guys like Ron will stick around for a while, and then you'll get these champions, and that's what it is, the people that are really willing to go out in the loneliest possible way and fight against another person that they can't dehumanize. This guy's another person that they're killing. So it's actually a lot more psychological trauma on you. It doesn't upset me to touch somebody that or threaten somebody that's trying to rob me on the street, but it is upsetting to fight a guy and beat him and then know that he's really hurt. Okay, so that's a psychological risk that you run there. And once you get a guy that's in this position where he's contesting in this heroic manner, it's more difficult to get him to get involved in hurting combat, where you're hurting other men into this combat and you're dehumanizing the enemy as much as you can, because this is how you can get lesser guys that can't stomach killing somebody that they can conceptualize as a human being into it. Okay, so, and my old theory, the reason why I brought it up, Ron and I both thought that these people that were really into like these orgies and group sex and everything, there's got to be a reason for that, and it probably goes back to them probably being dissatisfied or not very effective in a one-on-one situation. And it's the same reason why you'll see people that are politician types starting wars, and then people who came from the military and served will generally be less likely to start the war than a pure politician. And you'll have a woman is more likely to start a war when she's head of state than a man is. So there's a problem with depending on heroes, even for an ancient king like Agamemnon, because now his Achilles ended up developing empathy for Hector, the guy that he killed. His main job was killing that guy. He was the head general for the Trojans. And there's a real worry on the part of even the primitive head of state that his heroes are going to develop empathy for their opposites, and they're not going to be as ruthless as you want them to be. So that's probably the main reason why that type of heroism gets eclipsed as soon as it can be managed, and then it turns into the hero as a leader, where he's out there taking a risk to inspire his men to also take a risk, because if you can inspire enough other guys to charge through this hole, then you can really accomplish something. So the hero he goes from the person that's in this special ritual combat that's going to affect the morale of both of the armies. So if Hector and Achilles are fighting each other, or two Irish heroes are fighting each other between the lines of the army, whichever hero wins, that gives a big morale boost to the army. So basically what it is it's a bump up in your enthusiasm for combat on the side of the winner. So that could be really important. There were examples of individual frontline combatants turning the tides of battles. Permachus of Pallene was a Pancratian champion who actually defeated the giant Polydamas, and he was considered responsible for defeating the army of Corinth. Pallene was a small neighbor of Corinth, and Corinth was picking on it. This guy happened to be in the front line, and by himself, he broke his small portion. The guys on the other side, this is like professional NFL linebackers against regular military guys with shields and spears. The prime athlete will literally run the other guy over, and if he then immediately makes a turn, he could start folding up the other line, and then you can turn your line into a spear point, and the whole enemy line falls apart. The Roman infantryman was trained on this basis. It was an improvement over the type of infantry that Permachus ran over, because the Romans tried to make every guy that guy, and they would have a backup thing where they could all form a line. But generally when they fought as individuals, and that's why the Roman army was really so feared, because these guys were actually trained to fight as individuals, and they would keep going when the guy next to him fell, and the guy behind the guy next to him would step up. So in that sense, you had a lot of working class Roman heroes that would be lauded in their time, and I found some scraps written about them, mainly that they had no wounds in their back, that they died and all their wounds were in their front, and this was a very important thing to the Romans. But these were disposable heroes. They didn't rise to command large bodies of troops. There was a real problem with this type of heroism, and when you start scaling up to battles with 50,000 guys on the side, Spartacus did the same thing. Spartacus killed numerous centurions trying to get to Crassus, who was the general of the Roman army. And this was the 9th Roman army that Spartacus and his gladiators faced, and it was the only battle that they lost. And they lost it after he got cut down. And he was attempting to turn the tide of the battle by just going and cutting the other leader's head off. And the three baddest dudes in the Roman army were set out to stop him. The third guy put a fork in him and got it done. So this idea of the individual hero, it doesn't really survive the ancient world intact. It turns into the hero general when the Greek Empire takes over from the Latin part of the empire and they're fighting the Persians. You have guys fighting like Alexander the Great again, following that example. So that you have hero kings in what was the early Byzantine Empire. And then through the medieval period, you would have a lot of hero kings and hero generals. Because of the type of warfare, it was a small scale. You might only have hundreds or just a couple thousand guys on the side. But then that goes away again with gunpowder.
You had Milo of Croton there as well.
Milo Croton dressed up like Hercules, carved down some tree trunk for his Hercules club, put a lion skin on, and bashed the shit out of enough Sybarites. Sybaris was actually, it's an insult. To call you a Sybarite is to call you a rich sissy in ancient language. Well, Croton wiped out Sybaris, and it was in 510, I think it was 510, in the battle where Milo was in the front line. And he wasn't a general or anything. He was just a hero. But if you could get a guy that's essentially like the world's strongest man and give him a big club and he could just blast a big hole in the line, the other guys can go through it. So that was probably a pretty easy thing to do. The idea of the hero becomes problematical with gunpowder. And the hero kings like Gustavus Adolphus get killed in the line of fire because they're out there trying to do too much on horseback. So what you got towards the end of the age of black powder in the 1700s, late 1600s to the early 1800s, the idea, the heroic ideal was kept alive in two ways. One, if you had a genetic freak in the army, you might give him a special detail. There was a giant that actually fought on the side of the rebels in the Revolutionary War that did some heroic things. I forget his name. But generally what it was the commander showing no fear. Since you could just be impersonally killed while you're lining up with your bright uniforms and firing at each other with your giant banks of black powder weapons, what the leaders did was they demonstrated a lack of fear and under fire. The Duke of Parma, who was the Spaniard who was in charge of ethnically cleansed Holland, and it didn't work. He would, if he was besieging a Dutch town, he would set up a picnic table outside of the walls within range of the artillery, and the Dutch artillery would be trying to blast him and the picnic table to hell while he's having a banquet out there with his officers. And this is how he sorts his officers out and find out who's got the calm and the cool to undertake certain military missions. So you've got to sit there at this picnic with this psychopath and not flinch while these cannonballs are literally being aimed at you from a half a mile away. And there was one episode where the officer next to him, who was from Walloon, got his head taken off by a cannonball, and splinters from the skull actually killed two other officers. And this guy keeps eating. Okay, so in the age of gunpowder, a general like that was highly prized. The English thought that if he got across the channel, this is the idea behind the Armada, was to get this asshole across the English Channel into England. Because once he got into England with 20,000 Spaniards, that was it. They were going to take the place. And the English knew that, but unfortunately for the Spanish Navy totally sucked.
Horatio Nelson, is that who you're talking about?
Now, Horatio Nelson is actually, the idea of the English defending their country and imposing their will on people becomes totally maritime after the Armada. That was just too easy. So it gets to the point in the Napoleonic Wars where the British Army generally doesn't have much to do unless it's fighting in this out-of-the-way peninsula in Portugal or something like that against a third-string general. You would have guys like Cochrane in smaller ships and Horatio Nelson in ships of the line just off the cuff putting together their own amphibious operation against some Spanish island somewhere and taking 500 sailors and dragging cannons up on top of mountains to bomb inside of these fortresses and get these places to surrender. Nelson lost his arm in the Canary Islands on Tenerife. He's trying to land on a beach against emplaced artillery in a wooden boat. Even modern Marines would never try this. It was far more ridiculous than anything that was attempted in World War II. It was worse than Dieppe, which was basically using 10,000 Canadians as suicide troops just to see what the Germans could do against an amphibious landing. So the heroism during the gunpowder age is primarily going to stay with small operations officers like Rogers. The most famous guy in the French and Indian War was Rogers of Rogers Rangers. And he got together 60 guys to go wipe out this Abenaki town where these Abenaki raiders used to terrorize New England from. So he's a legit hero. When he got locked up, this guy he's had more success than any other British officer in that war. And during that war, his commanding officer did not make proper arrangements to supply his men. So his men wouldn't starve to death. They hadn't had nothing to eat for weeks. And they had had this horrific march. He had credit because he had status, and it was assumed that he had wealthy friends and backers. And if he got blankets and food for his men on credit, that the general that was his commander would back up that payment and issue the payment for the goods. This wasn't done. So Rogers was actually jailed as a debt slave, and he was going to be sold as a servant. And the war is not even over yet. While the war was still on, and this was in Manhattan, where nobody gave a shit about him because it was essentially more of a European, Dutch-type city, a whole company of British regulars who never even served with him, but they followed him in the news. They went and they broke him out of the goal, and they got him out of there. So you would have that kind of hero, like Robert Rogers, like the Swamp Fox, Marion, which was kind of, you saw a bastardized version in the Patriot movie with Mel Gibson that was highly inaccurate, but it gives you an idea that you can have a hero in the special operations realm. You can have a hero. Other than that, and even then, he's an officer. He's a captain or he's a major. These guys I just discussed were majors. But for the most part, your heroes are now going to be generals. They're going to be guys that will actually get out there and get shot at. And the most prevalent hero, when we can circle back to the Civil War at the end, would be Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's probably the last Aryan hero, probably the last guy that ancient people of European descent would in any way recognize as a heroic figure, would probably be Nathan Bedford Forrest. And that was in the war where his type of personality was put on the extinction list, but his type of operation was already seen to be necessary. The German general staff, all the way back to the Prussian general staff, they were studying him and specifically his battle at Bryce's Crossroads in preparations for World War I and World War II. And the other people that they studied were the Mongols. So you had the German war machine that wrecked superior forces in those two wars. They basically studied Forrest and they studied the Mongols. And this was a way to get around the fact that you didn't have the same industrial capacity and you didn't have as many men as the other guy. And a civil war is an example. If you want to fight a superior force in an industrial setting, you need to look at the Civil War as an example of how you do it. And they did. And, unfortunately, they were facing better than 15-1 odds. So it wasn't going to win. It wasn't going to end up with a W at the end of it.
Yeah, you had that under the machine, I think.
Rommel's probably the best example in World War II. And Patton would be the Allied example of guys that had a heroic image. Patton manufactured through his personality more, and Rommel did it more just through having the absolute trust in his men. His men knew that this guy was going to find out the best solution, that he was the smartest guy and he had the coolest head, and he could glance at terrain he hadn't surveyed and still come up with something that's really going to work. What you needed, you didn't have time to map everything out in North Africa because the number of troops you had and vehicles were so tiny compared to the vast distances you traversed, which essentially made him like a cavalry commander in the old way. He would have been like a guy that would have been riding a horse 100 years before.
What about liver-eating Johnson?
In the frontier situation, you have a lot of people who would live these heroic lives, and they were actually the Robert Redford movie, Jeremiah Johnson, that was basically all made up. he didn't even, the Crows were his friends. He didn't even fight against the Crows, which was supposed to be his main enemy in that movie. But in his actual life story, he spent a long period of time living in a number of cabins on the edge of Sioux territory, and he had worked as a woodchuck, which, a guy chopping wood for steamships. And the Sioux loved murdering these guys. And he had also been a wolfer, which is a guy that poisoned wolves. He'd hunt bison, and then he'd poison the bison flesh, and it would kill the wolves. So he's not a very savory character from our perspective. But he ended up basically getting in a feud with two tribes, the Blackfeet and the Sioux. Now, what he did with the Blackfeet is every other tribe were afraid of the Blackfeet. He poisoned them. He got himself boxed into a canyon that they didn't know that there was a back door to, and he was famous for making biscuits. So he made strychnine biscuits. So after he snuck out the back door, he left these biscuits behind with the skillet still going, and, well, these guys eat these things, they die of poisoning, and after that, he was able to travel through Crow territory unmolested. They wouldn't even mess with him. He would sell liquor to Indians in Canada that was brewed over in Montana, and he'd go through Blackfeet territory, and their name for him was Bad Medicine.
Yeah.
Okay? He was just bad luck. It was bad luck getting on the road. So to him, he's a serial killer. He's just some psycho that's poisoning people. But they respected that. This guy actually used himself as bait to poison them. And what he did with the Sioux is he would put like trap doors on the bottom of his cabin, so they would burn him out of his cabin, and then he'd pop up 50 yards behind him, and he'd shoot him in the back. And they thought he was like, and he made this joke out of eating a Sioux liver after him and his buddies killed some Sioux Indians in a battle one time, and this got around. It was his nickname, but he never actually ate it. But what he would do is after he would kill these Sioux Indians, he would boil their skulls in a kettle, and then he would write epitaphs on them. He would write things like, oops, or where's my hair? Oh, gosh, my powder's wet.
He's a terrorist.
Make like jokes out of them, and he would sell them to people on riverboats. He would stand there with just a pajama top on, with his bottom half naked, standing in the river in the morning, taking his bath, cussing out the people on the rich people on the riverboats, and then he would sell these bleached Sioux skulls that he put these epitaphs on. So
what you're saying is that the champion, the hero, has nowadays is like crank that lives in a cabin, or not, it would be the homeless guy who's ranting at. We've lost that, right? We've lost a lot.
Well, people like Johnson, he didn't have the nobility of Achilles, okay, but the enemies feared him in the same fashion, and the people at the top of the society that he essentially fought for also had a certain respect for him, even though he was considered unclean. Like Agamemnon very much valued Achilles, but he hated him. There were generals. General Miles valued Liver Eaton Johnson as a guide a lot, and Johnson was criticized for not going into some bushes after a bear one time. He said, I thought you were Liver Eaton Johnson. He said, I'm not stupid. I said, you go in there after that bear. I'm not going in there after that bear. And so at a certain, whatever your milieu is, the hero isn't just somebody that takes a mindless risk and then by luck succeeds. That'll happen for a general one time, and then if he's smart, he'll bank on that and not go back to that well unless his army is losing. Okay? You don't want to end up like Gustavus Adolphus. But for a guy that's a fringe character, that's like a frontier type hero, I guess in a way, like a guy like Ron. Okay? People liked reading Big Ron's stories because he would actually go into a black neighborhood, into their bar, and drink with these guys. And he'd walk outside, and then when a couple of them would mess with him, he'd say, you just shut up or I'm going to close your chicken hole. And then they would back off because it's like he's the crazy white boy. People don't want Ron marrying their daughter, okay? But they like the idea of thinking Ron's on their side. And if they had to go to a NFL game or a boxing match around a bunch of Neanderthals, they'd probably like to go with Ron in case something happened. So you do have this type of, it's like niche heroism that is just something that people that are alienated by society, they'll look at a person as a hero in that sense.
It's the
because
taboo thing.
Right. So he's doing something against the grain. But as far as the enemy goes, it's always the same thing. It might change. The hero status might change in regards to his host population, because the hero is usually an alienated person. The individual combat, Achilles being driven in this chariot out to this hill to fight another guy, that's an alienating experience. They're not fighting in the ranks. He's fighting separately. So the honor that's given by the host population to the hero diminishes as our society becomes more industrialized and then modern, because his impact is smaller. But wherever he's facing enemy people, there was a guy, Richard Marcinko, who a lot of Navy SEALs don't like because he turned out to be like a showboat guy, but the Viet Cong put a price on his head. He was one of the early Navy SEALs who figured out how you just go out and hunt humans at night. And the Viet Cong put a price on his head. And he was a pariah in the U.S. Navy and in the military. Even his commanders usually wouldn't like him because he'd always want to do something that was against their rules. But as far as the enemy went, he was a hero. They hated him. They put more store on getting his head than killing any other man that fought for the U.S. military at the time. And so you'll still have that in certain areas. Usually it'll come down to a sniper. There'll be a certain sniper on a certain front who he'll probably, the people he's killing will give him a name, and they'll mythologize this guy, and they really want this guy to be killed. And then when he gets killed, they kind of miss him because he's actually become a part of their construct about how they go about things. There are a lot of things like that during the Korean War and during World War II. There's a guy named Lewis Millett who he found some literature from the Chi-Coms. And this is after war had gotten static in Korea, when the Chinese were full into it. You're basically fighting mostly Chinese. And this literature that was meant for Chinese frontline troops who were given this stuff to read to boost their morale said that used the bayonet against the Americans because they're afraid of the bayonet. Well, he went and he found a bunch of bayonets that had not been issued, and he sharpened them and he gave them to his men. I think it's 36 men in the platoon. And he went out looking for a hill to charge. And he found a hill where there's a bunch of Chinese dug in, and he charged up the hill and his men followed him. And there was a part where a hand grenade was rolled down the hill and bounced off of his shin, and then luckily exploded away from his feet. And he gets to the top of the hill, and he was a big guy. His son died in the first Gulf War, and I saw him cry in an interview about this because he was really a heroic type of guy. And he was I think he was a Swedish American guy. He was stabbing these Chinese guys in the head and picking them up out of the foxhole on the end of the bayonet. And he said it was like cutting cheese. The bayonet just went right through the head. And they actually won this battle with the bayonet. He was forbidden to do this again because it was considered, this is the way we're going to fight. But there's still, that happens more and more on a small scale. There was a guy, an officer, a lieutenant in World War I who died killing a bunch of Germans with a shovel. And Pershing tried to block the award that went to Sergeant York because he wanted to go to this guy because he was actually of the aristocracy. He was an officer. But they went with Sergeant York to try to appeal to working people after the war because the working people have been hosed in this war. So they're all over the place. You could take just one modern war, and you could find a dozen guys that would be heroes by ancient standards, and most of them didn't live. And they were probably, after they had their one major battle, like Audie Murphy basically defeating the battalion of Germans on his own with a machine gun. After this has happened, the higher-ups will try to make this guy into an icon for the troops, and they'll pull him out of the front line because they know this guy doesn't live long in modern warfare. So there's actually an attempt to save a guy once he's identified as a hero and get him out of the line of fire so you can use him as an example for other guys, and they might want to follow in his footsteps. And that was policy. Probably the last major American infantry hero would be Carlos Hathcock. Him and his partner, he was a sniper, pinned down a whole company of Vietnamese on a rice paddy, and it was as if this would be a Vietnamese horror movie. These guys spent like 24 hours getting shot to death by these guys they couldn't see. Just two guys did this to them. The sniper really has become the last modern war hero because he's the only one that's survivable in a reusable fashion. Hathcock ended up suffering terrible burns. I think he rescued some people out of a burning armored personnel carrier. But you can actually keep snipers in combat for a long period of time, and that's why they made that movie American Sniper about that one guy, because it's about the only way where you can have a heroic performance from an individual and then let him try to repeat it, because he's got a good chance of survival because he's operating at such a distance and he has intelligence support. The frontline infantry hero, he's not going to make it through his third battle. And so they try to pull him out before that. There was a guy that wrote a book. I'd like you to put this up on a link. It's an Italian last name. I just can't remember it. He wrote a book called House to House. It was about the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004 in the Iraq War. And this guy actually, by himself, he actually took out all of these. These were Fedayeen. These were foreign fighters. These guys were from Chechnya and other places. In this house, he actually had a bard there recording it. There was a famous, I can't remember his name, but he's a famous Australian wars correspondent that was actually shouting and whispering encouragement to him while he was going deeper into this house. And he ends up killing this guy, beating him to death with a helmet. And the guy that he beats to death with a helmet, he doesn't beat him to death with a helmet. He beats him with a helmet, and then he ends up strangling him to death. And as the guy's dying, the guy pats him on his cheek, almost like he was letting him know it was okay. So, and then immediately after this happens with this guy, him and his men are used in this dog and pony show. They're made to shave, even though they've got sores all over their body from crawling around in dirt. They're made to shave for this asshole General Petraeus that's showing up with all his rear echelon people to enjoy the banquet that's supposed to celebrate their heroism. And it's really a negation of the hero. It's just a general showing up to take credit for what this guy did. And if you want to look at where being a hero in a military situation gets you today, you want to read that book, House to House. And you become a psychological casualty. I mean, he was stronger than most. Well, fortunately, he was in a leadership position. So he had other responsibilities for his men that helped him. You could tell in the narrative where being responsible for other men actually helped him get through this and not be as damaged by the experience later on. They're either that guy who hopefully gets out right after the battle and gets sent home, or he's a sniper that'll get reused and will eventually be hired as a military contractor and used to shoot civilians of his own country. So it's a way where the management, they're either going to negate the frontline soldier war hero, or they're going to do something to corrupt, the sniper war hero and, turn him into their tool. There's a good coverage of that in a movie that's somewhat fanciful. I think it's called Shooter or Snipers. Mark Wahlberg plays a sniper. And,
I don't know that one. And
Danny Glover actually plays an evil deep state guy. It's probably your last chance to see an African-American actor cast as a villain. I think it was like a 2008 movie, so you might want to watch it. It was kind of like an anti-Bush administration hero movie. That was pretty cool.
Oh yeah.
I would recommend.
I just have a little situation.
I understand. Now,
she's okay.
If we could go back to the Civil War, I'll tell you about Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay. Forrest, when he's 13, loses his father, and he's now head of household. His first heroic act was actually when he was 11 years old, when he decided to stand and fight dogs that were attacking him, and the dogs backed off. And then he learned the importance of psychology right then. Then, when he was 16, his mother and her sister were attacked by a Black Panther. This was not a dissident escaped slave or anything. This was an actual black cougar or black puma that attacked his mother. He had a single shot muzzle-loading rifle, and he had his dogs. He tracked this thing down, and he had to wait up all night in the dark forest to shoot this thing out of the tree, because he couldn't take a chance shot at night because he needed the trophy. He needed to take the cougar ears back and show the men in the neighborhood and prove that he avenged this attack on his mother. the man that lived next door to him that owned a bull that kept on knocking over Nathan's mother's fence, Nathan killed the bull or threatened to kill the bull. And the guy said that if you kill my bull, I'll kill you. And the 16-year-old kid is like, well, come and get it. Okay, because you're going to have to kill me. So he gets this reputation as a killer that will stand up to you face to face. So people want to go into business with him because being in business around Memphis in the 1850s, late 1840s and early 1850s, was kind of like being in the mafia in New York or Chicago in the 1920s or 1930s. He becomes business partner with a man who has 4 men ride up to him, and they immediately shoot and kill his business partner. He shoots down one of the killers. The other ones run for cover with one had a shotgun, one had a pistol, and Nathan runs out of his 6 shots and this is ball and this isn't cartridge ammunition. You got to separately load the ball and the powder into this revolver. So when it's done, it's done. And he runs out and somebody in town throws him a Bowie knife. And he takes his Bowie knife and he goes after these 2 guys that are armed with guns and they run away. Okay. So now everybody wants to be business partners with young Nathan because they know when typically the competition will get rid of you by just coming and killing you. And they want to be business partners with Nathan. So Nathan ends up becoming a very successful slave trader. And one of the main ways he did this was he made sure that his slaves were not beaten and they were well fed. The people that he dealt with, you can find ads, and he's considered an evil person because of this, because he was a slave trader. But at the time, he grew to the top of his business, and there was another murder involved here where somebody tried to murder his partner and he gunned him down or beat him up or something like that. And because these guys were also gamblers, he advertised that his were the healthiest, best treated slaves there were, and they were useful for housework. These people had not been beaten and ill fed, and you could allow them in your house. And he would guarantee their behavior. You get a refund on your slave from old Uncle Nathan. So that's what kind of guy he was. He's a gambler on a steamship, and the captain of the steamship decides to have a race with this other steamship captain, and the boiler blows up. And he knows the boiler is going to blow up. He goes up to the captain. He says, you have to knock this off because the boiler is going to blow up. And the captain tells him to go to hell. So Nathan actually does what he can to save people on this thing and conducts his own onboard salvage operation and saves people from drowning and gets them onto the other thing. He did this after the war with the train that derailed. When he was an ex-Confederate, he was an officer for the losing side. There's a bunch of Union soldiers on this train that derailed, and he put them all to work. And the leaders in the Confederacy and the Union, and later on in the United States as a whole, they hated his guts because he was a stand-up guy. And his battle record, he killed 13 men with a sword during the Civil War. The Yankees were more apt to use the sword than the Confederates were, because the Confederates had more sense. They would ride up to you and shoot you rather than try to run you through. But he wanted to put the fear of the devil into the Yankees. So he got a sword and he sharpened it on both ends, and he made a habit out of going up and skewering at least one Yankee in every battle if he could get his hands on him. He was shot like 5 times. He charged Sherman's brigade by himself. His men didn't even follow him because they thought it was insane, and got shot in the spine from the front. The mini ball lodged up against his spinal column, and then he picked up some guy with one hand and used him as a human shield and ran back to his own lines. But he killed at least one Confederate trooper who was retreating. The guy was running away with a Confederate flag. He shot him dead, and he took the flag and he said, "I'll shoot the rest of you boys too. You got to get back there and put this to them Yankees." So
he sounds really like more of a rounded character because he would fight bravely on his own, but he had leadership.
Oh, yeah. And he had monstrous qualities. There was some officer had thought that Nathan insulted him, and he hadn't meant to, but apparently in their code of honor he did. And the guy walks up to him and shoots him in the hallway of his office while he's in Nashville occupying the place at some point during the war. And he kills this guy. He stabs this guy with a penknife that he had in his pocket, and he doesn't know that this guy is bleeding to death. He thinks he's mortally wounded. He goes and gets a gun. He says, "By God, no man will kill me and live." And he goes hunting for this guy, And eventually, there's different legends about what happened, but apparently people successfully hid this dude from Nathan while he bled to death. And then later he felt bad about killing him with a knife. There were numerous situations where he shot guys at point blank range during battles with his pistol. He killed over 30 men, 13 with a sword, killed over 30 men. He was proud of saying that for every horse that was shot out from underneath of him, he had personally planted one Yankee in the ground. Okay, because he lost like 30 or 33 horses were killed underneath him.
Wow.
So they're shooting at this guy with cannonballs. And when, I guess for a horse to get hit with a cannonball is like a rabbit getting hit with a rifled slug from a shotgun. So it's pretty ugly, but he survived having 33 horses shot out from underneath of him. And he still had, sometimes he would go crazy and go too far. And people would describe how he would get this insane look and he would get all flushed. And he would apparently could yell louder than anybody that they had ever heard. So that put an impression on people. But he had the ability to immediately after the battle get cool about things. And now he was in a situation where he was also fighting the Confederate High Command because these other commanders would lose a lot of troops due to desertion. And he would round these guys up and dragoon them into his unit. And people knew where to go to get their runaway soldiers because they knew this was the guy that was out there rounding them up. And then he would actually have to negotiate for how many of his soldiers he could keep and how many of them he had to give back. And he knew after riding with him, these guys were going to run away again as soon as they got into another command.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Right. It was not led. If he announced that, he gets 600 guys, he scrapes them up out of, homeless camps. These guys have run away, and he goes and kills enough Union guys to arm these guys with Union weapons. The only way they're going to stay in the war is if they're fighting with somebody like him that's also taking a big risk, because in every battle at some point he's right up there on the front line. He's not running out ahead like an idiot because he's thinking like a squirrel hunter. He's smart. He's thinking like he was when he was a kid, going after that panther. So with him, you get the combination of Bobby Lee, where all these guys are willing to die for him, and Rommel, all these guys are willing to die for him because they knew that he cared about them. He cared about them more than he cared about the head of state. Rommel and Lee would both disobey the head of state if they thought it was better for their men, and it would save some of their men's lives. So their men would have that love for him, but they also had that respect that fighting men have for a hero because he would go out front and get his hands red in the fight. Famously could not get along with a lot of other generals, and he would threaten to beat up other generals, and this was not taken very well. So Nathan Bedford Forrest was probably the last heroic leader. Patton tried to play at being Forrest, but he was at a point where it was beyond reason to go with your pistol on the front line in World War II in the Ardennes. Wasn't going to happen. So he acted like Forrest and pushed his men like Forrest did, but he was now in a setting where it was no longer really possible for him to take the lead tank and go out there and think he wasn't going to get killed in the first battle. So as far as real American hero leaders, Nathan Bedford Forrest would be next to the last. The last would be General Joe Shelby, who won the last battle of the Civil War at Matamoros and Brownsville, Texas-Mexican border. And then he rode with his 500 men into Mexico and became mercenaries for the Maximilian regime down there.
What can you say about current conflicts that are being waged right now? I don't know. I feel like they're so opaque and mostly not what I would think of as genuine wars. I don't know, maybe the Kurds are doing something that is really in their own interest, but it's so hard to tell nowadays what is a war versus what is some kind of deep state operation or just a proxy action, or you know what I mean?
Two books that I think are good to read for this in the modern sets in Afghanistan. Samuel Finlay's book, Breakfast with a Dirt Cult, gives you a perspective on it, particularly this one operation going up a mountain. And the other one would be Lone Survivor, which was made into a movie starring Mark Wahlberg, and it was an excellent, accurate movie. I read this book. right after I read this book, I met in the locker room on a fight where I was fighting. One of the guys in my locker room was a former Navy SEAL who was still their empty hand instructor. And he knew and had trained all these guys that had been in this battle that's depicted in Lone Survivor. But the last half hours of that movie is total jingoistic bullshit. It's a total lie, didn't happen, and they just ruin it. So what you need to do is watch Lone Survivor, and then right when the Mark Wahlberg character, who's a real dude, and he was on set for the movie and everything, so he made sure that everything except for the military advertisement at the end of it was authentic. At the point where he is granted shelter by the Pashtun tribesmen who protect him from the Taliban, stop the movie. Don't watch any more of the movie. Okay. The next 30 minutes of the movie is revenge for Black Hawk Down. It's some neocon fantasy about stuff that doesn't even happen. So the heroism that you see in Lone Survivor, it's not on the point of view of the guy that survived. It's the three guys that died. There was some stupidity on the point of the guys that loaded into the Chinook and got taken out with an RPG, and you lost a huge amount of guys. But the four guys that sat down, the three of them, all three of these guys that died to save the other guys. So the last guy, his mission was to let people know this. That's the mission he brought on himself. That because all three of these guys died in detail, one by one, to save him. And he wasn't the stud in the group. He wasn't the best shooter in the group. He wasn't the commander. He wasn't the smartest guy in the group. And they all died to save him. And so there's three heroes right then. It's really a perfect story. If you cut it out, if you cut out the last 30 minutes, just please cut out the last 30 minutes. And I'd read Breakfast with the Dirt because it shows you the disillusion of somebody who believes that going into American military operations overseas is going to allow you to relive some of the honor experiences that guys maybe in the Civil War or World War II used to be able to experience. But when you talk to all the guys I talked to that survived World War II, it was just a meat grinder, and they just felt lucky to get out of it. So part of that is when you have million-man armies facing each other and the government picks out a couple of the heroes that survived, like Aldi Murphy and Sergeant York, and they put them up there, that gives us a false perspective that this is available to the general guy. But not only do you have to be remarkable, you've got to be extremely lucky. And if you don't come to the attention of the higher ups right away, after you're extremely lucky, your extreme luck's going to run out. So right now, our guys in heroic positions are on these different special ops units, and they've got to stay in 20 years to get their pension, and they're going on combat. The combat tours, I think, are like 3 months now. They're having to go into combat more often than any other militaries regularly put men in combat, except in situations like the American Civil War, which literally ate tens and hundreds of thousands of guys. So they're tending to get out before retirement and become military contractors. It's a real cynical play on the part of the management, the neocon management, to turn these guys into contractors. Otherwise, they go insane. I think 37 days is like the maximum that a person can be in combat operations and not go nuts. So the military knows that. They're using that. They make high demands on these guys. And a lot of the things that they've done that you're not going to hear apart. I was one of my bus drivers who did a heroic thing on a bus, actually got discharged from the U.S. Army. He was in the Special Forces. He was discharged after he was shot on a DEA operation. He was doing a drug interdiction mission as a military man, and he was shot through and through the oblique muscles on his right side, which he showed me the wound. But the real heroic thing he did was take out a hood rat with a 357 on an MTA bus. When the guy pressed the muzzle of this 357, which was single action, not a double action, and made the mistake of cocking the hammer back instead of just pulling the trigger, and this guy stripped the gun out of his hand, stomped out his ankles, knees, and back, and crippled the guy. Since he was an MTA officer and he was actually shot, he was excused for what would have otherwise gotten a police officer in trouble. So, the military machine, such as it is, it's a chance for adventure for young men, and you're going to have guys that really behaved as heroes coming back into our society where there's no place for a hero. So that's where I see things now. in a way, you want a guy to go overseas to get that kind of experience and come back so he knows what's really going on in the world, and he'd be able to organize something here if there's ever some type of disaster. But on the other hand, there's not really a place for him when he comes back, unless he's willing to sell his soul as a contract. That's where it's looking like from here in, from the point of view of a war geek, a guy that only male member of my family that didn't get into the military, literally because that's all I read about. And after reading about it, I didn't want to be involved in it. So that's what I say. And one day there'll come a time when there's room for heroes again, but not in the current situation.
Well, earlier, James, you mentioned that you had been studying for the Spaniards, studying the entradas, and I read A Sickness of the Heart and Our Captain, and those were individuals, usually one guy in charge of just a small number of men. Can you talk about those and how that relates?
The first leader, Hernandez, I think was his name, Grijalva. Can you pronounce the second leader?
Grijalva.
Okay, all right. There's no chance I get that down. All right. The first leader really came off as an old Crusader knight. He was worried about his men. He didn't want his men to get killed, and he wanted to go out front and make sure they were all safe and fight the enemy. Not a great tactician, not good at politics, but his men really loved him. He ended up dying from his wounds on the return to Cuba. After a mission that was not successful, other than that, Diaz, I forget his first name, the guy that wrote the whole thing, I think I remember his first name. Diaz was his second name. He had left some orange pits behind that he had planted, and the Mayan priests in the Yucatan outside of this temple actually cultivated those plants until they became trees, and he got to see them when he was an old man. And he was just a lieutenant in this. He was never a heroic figure. He was the guy that really documented the heroism of his betters. And the G-Man, can you say his last name again?
Grijalva.
Okay. Now, he really loved him. And so the second volume is another minor pre-Cortez expedition into Mexico, which actually definitely comes to the attention of Montezuma. And there is also at least one horrendous battle, also an amphibious battle where they're fighting these Aztec proxy troops that are in canoes, and they're out there in gunboats and all. These guys loved that man. He was really what kept them fighting, and the other co-commanders were scheming behind his back, and he was totally sidelined before the expedition that became the Cortez expedition, which was hijacked by Cortez, who was a lawyer. So in Cortez, you get the unlikely hero who was also a general, a diplomat, a crusader, and a lawyer. This is a guy that broke his ankle jumping out of some other man's wife's bedroom over in Spain, and makes his way to Cuba to find his fortune. He's a total scumbag, ruthless, but he's brilliant and he's brave. He's not afraid to go out there and fight on the front line. So every single entrada that you look at, you've got multiple heroes in that. If I ever do a narrative on Cortez's actual expedition, I derailed it because of problems getting help with the translation. There was a man who was essentially a crusader knight fighting against the Aztecs on these causeways. And it was just a hellish battle. You get to see a lot of heroism in the early phases of Latin America. These guys their grandfathers had fought in the Reconquista, had driven the Moors out, and they had this crusading mentality. This land was basically discovered. Columbus's mission was to actually attack Islam from behind. So these guys are like crazy crusading Catholics. The type of novels they read was just ridiculous. Blood on every page. It was something like some really conscienceless horror sci-fi writer would write today.
Are you talking about the books that they were reading, like some literature?
Oh, they read popular fiction that would be the counterpart of the Western dime novel or the English penny dreadful. That's just like hack writing for men in the lower nobility to read.
Oh.
And it's about rescuing maidens and slaying dragons. And,
I wonder if Don Quixote was like a satire of those books or something? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, it's so funny.
But these guys, this is the stuff that they read. This would be like you had Navy SEALs in Iraq they read Punisher comic books when they were kids, which is about this guy that's not a superhero and he just got guns and he's an Avenger. And they had Punisher images on their vehicles and on their helmets and on their armor and stuff like that. So it was the same type of thing where you had this heroic image that was cultivated at home and then it was later employed in the field. Now, you no longer, the heroic image that was cultivated for guys that fought up through 2010 when they were kids, that's no longer present. That's not going to be there. And comic books, for instance, and other media. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of a frontline fighter emerges 20 years from now.
From the SJW culture that we have. Right?
Yeah, it's essentially going to have to be somebody that's going to be regarded as a human weapon. It's going to be like it was a terrible Sylvester Stallone movie, Demolition Man or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, it's like the guy where in time of war break glass and he cracked this guy out. But if it's not wartime, he's got to be locked up in some chamber. Maybe it's something like that. I'm inclined to go that way. That you're going to end up with some genetically selected and really people that are manufactured to be psychopaths as far as their indoctrination goes. And they're going to keep them drugged up, except for when they're killing people. That's just my personal theory.
Well, that sounds awful. But you have a tendency to be right about these things, unfortunately.
Well, that whole series of novels, the Sunset Saga, was basically about one of those guys rebelling against his design. And it was the same thing that Organo was about. It's about a guy that's designed to be a certain thing, and then he rebels against his design, trying to rebel against the machine.
Yeah.
So
I think that's something I'd like to talk about maybe another time, is the unpredictability, impulsiveness, and sort of risk-taking. It's kind of, I see it as a personality trait, a characteristic. I see it as the European characteristic, but that's my bias maybe. But maybe, for another topic.
It's interesting in that there's definitely, if you look at warfare and literature, there's different rates of frequency in different racial groups and different ethnic groups of this trait. It's one theory is that, for instance, dogs. One theory, actually Bob sent it, he said it's just a theory, but that the close relationship that European men had with their hunting dogs, for instance, was totally different than a lot of other relationships with dogs that other societies had. In the Americas, they just ate them and they used them to haul stuff around on. They didn't even use them for hunting. There was no dog hunting culture in the Americas when Europeans got here. That was totally introduced, having a dog that goes out and hunt. And the most warlike people on the planet, really, for a long period of time, were the British. They managed to conquer more of the world than anybody else, and more different economic zones and different habitats than anybody, and they usually did it way against the odds. And for some reason, most of your hunting dog breeds come out of the British Isles. All these terriers. I mean, almost every type of terrier comes out of the British Isles.
And beagles and hounds. Yeah,
so there could be something to that. There's a complex there. I mean, you can find heroes in every culture, but outside of European culture, they prop up most predominantly in Japanese, Polynesian, and Native American cultures, or where you will see that the most.
All right. Well, let's save that.
Okay.
For another one. Well, thank you, James. As usual, I have a simple question, and you have lots of interesting answers and directions to go, so I really appreciate it.
I had to get back to Nathan Bedford Forrest. So
what an interesting life. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah. All right, that was episode 34. Thanks, everybody.